Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss here with another biology recap video. Today is a recap from Thursday, September 24th. And today we started off the class just kind of acknowledging some of the protest and the movement that's happening across the United States. So we wanted to make sure we took some time to acknowledge that's happening and the role that biology education can play in all of us recognizing how much more similar we are to each other than different biologically. That was is a powerful thing to bring up. So we then asked you all students to just hold that thought and reach out to teachers if you want to have that discussion with us. And while you're holding that in one place, if we asked the classes if we could move on with the content today, if we're ready to move on with that content. And you all thought, yeah, we can have that in one place, and I know I can have that conversation. And today we can move on with this work and recognize that while this isn't specifically, ecology obviously isn't specifically geared towards racial justice, we brought up that there is a connection in an environmental justice and sustainability in an environment and in intersectionality with racial equity. And that's a conversation that we're not going to dive into, but it's a conversation I'm ready to have with anyone who wants to have that conversation of how these can be related. So we use that as a bit of a transition into the work of today, and we saw the work of scientists that introduced us to the concepts of today, which is invasive species. And we watched a couple videos that kind of introduced us to the concept of invasive species. And then together as a class, we organized our thoughts into a document. That was the in-class practice number 7 for the day. And that document, I'm going to share right here really quick on my screen so that you can see that. And we got that from Canvas and we put it in Notability here. And what we identified is that an invasive species is not native to that environment and can grow and expand in that environment. So the first question though is, well, what does limit the population of the native species? And what we talked about it in terms of a graph of carrying capacity before. And we talked a few of these things. What are the things that limit the population growth of a species? And we identified predators, food supply, limited food supply, and disease. Those 3 factors can limit the population so that it can't just expand without any limit. And we also identify that climate can play a role, that sometimes frost during the winter can limit the population, can kill down a plant, or maybe a python can't live in a Wisconsin winter. So climate can play a role. And there was the example of rabbits in Australia who the climate in Australia suits that they can breed all year long, which certainly increases their population there. We then went on to try to get a sense of what do we mean when we're talking about an invasive species. And we talked about there are 2 qualities to an invasive species. And the first is it's a species that's introduced to a new ecosystem. And the other is it does not have its normal limits of population growth. And we talked about how, well, you could release a Burmese python, which is now taking over the Everglades of Florida. There's an estimation that there's 100,000 non-native pythons in the Everglades of Florida. We recognize that you could release that same species into a new environment in Wisconsin, and it's probably not going to become invasive because there are limits to its growth because of the climate. And we talked about how are these introduced, and really it's humans that are doing that. And they're hitching on to human transportation, like shipping vessels, like the zebra mussels that are attaching on to shipping containers and making their way into the Great Lakes and now expanding throughout. Pet release, right? So in the case of Florida, these Burmese pythons were being bred as pets. And when a Hurricane Andrew hit, it kind of devastated that facility and released these pythons out into the open, but they were intended as being pets. And a purposeful introduction. The example was used, two examples from the video was that there was the kudzu vine that was brought from Eastern Asia to the Southern United States for decorative, for cattle feed, and to limit erosion, and it's since taken over the South. And the other one was natural causes, right? So storms can move things through, and that's always been there in the history of the planet and hasn't really led to the collapse of ecosystems that invasive species have contributed to when humans, because humans can move a lot more of the species in a much more rapid time, and that's the difference there. Then we got to what do all invasive species have in common? And that's very similar to question 2, what is an invasive species? And the things that invasive species have in common is that they are non-native to that environment and there's no real limit to their population growth. And then finally, we talked about what is the impact of invasive species on biodiversity? And we came together as a class and we said, what do you think, up or down? And what we see is that, invasive species dramatically reduce biodiversity. They take over that space and they crowd out or destroy the native species there. And you just have a lot, because any given environment can only hold so many living things. And if all of those living things are one species, then there's not enough room for the other species. So invasive species limit biodiversity in an environment. And that's really what we talked about today. We introduced the homework, which is a fun PBS game where you try to play to eradicate the invasive species. And there are some questions related to that where in any given map of that game, you're asked to identify what's the food web, who are the producers, the consumers in there, and a couple other questions that are going to be great practice for the test, and more importantly, help us reflect back on what we've learned so far in this unit. So that was kind of quickly what we talked about in class today. And tomorrow's Friday, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you all in class tomorrow. So bye-bye.